Hey, there we go. All right, excellent. Let's see here. Well, I'm not rightly sure how to start. I guess I'm on. Can you hear me? All right, good to go then. Okay, I will be defending the opening premise, which is religion is fundamental to scientific reasoning and progress. And of course, I draw a lot of this from history itself. I would say that the counter argument is that, of course, religion has been disastrous or has held scientific progress back for particular ideologies or a ignorance or fear of science overruling God or disproving the things of God. But I think that in history, it's actually been quite the opposite. The question that needs to be asked is, of course, how and where did science arise? Looking back through up until the scientific revolution, even the medieval time period, you have the rise of science in Western Christendom and nowhere else. If you look at all of the countries that come prior to the Western transformation, your French, your European, Saxons, all those various tribes and kingdoms and cities, you find that science arises in a Christian ideology and not in a Chinese ideology or a South African or Papua New Guinea or any of the various countries that were raising up at the time. And this, I believe, is largely attributed to the concepts that come in religious truths. And I would argue the pinnacle is going to be Christianity. The nature of scientific reasoning comes down to three fundamentals, what you call the scientific hypothesis, and that is intelligibility, capability, and desirability. The intelligibility is the assumption that the universe is intelligible, that we can understand it and interpret it and know it in some various way. The capability is that the observable being has the capacity to be able to interpret the order of the universe, that we have rational minds and are capable of doing these kinds of inquisition and research to know how the universe is and how it works. And then desirability, the want or the desire to know how the universe works. I would say that in a naturalistic sense, a world without God, the intelligibility is really a flip coin. There's no true reasoning to believe that the universe should be. Now, it could be, but there's no objective sense that the universe has to be intelligible. And the same for the capability of the being, that there are Boltzmann brains, that there are passive observers able to actually understand the universe. Through a naturalistic sense, we can't truly draw any particular reason as to why we should be able to understand or interpret the universe. I believe this comes from a very specific ideology that the universe is intelligible, not for no reason, but for a very particular reason, that it has a creator and upholder of order that creates the fundamental nature of reality and upholds it in some sense, pantheistic, polytheistic, monotheistic, that we are able to interpret the universe because it has been designed to be interpreted, and that we are capable of doing so because we have been given the capacity to understand and interpret the things that a god or gods have made. And of course, the desirability, I think, is mildly subjective, that I think in an atheistic sense, there may be a desire to actually want to know about the universe. But in a theistic or polytheistic way, the desirability would be fundamental. You would want to know the creation of God or gods. You would want to know how the universe works, as can be seen in the works of some of the greatest scientists, or at the time, natural philosophers. And that would be, of course, here, let's quote Copernicus, who says that to know the mighty works of God, to comprehend his wisdom and majesty and power, to appreciate in degree the wonderful workings of his law, surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High, to whom ignorance cannot be more gratifying than knowledge. Of course, we all know the importance of Copernicus. Tycho Brahe, the modern astrophysicist in a sense, those who study the stars have God for teacher, studying at stars because you want to learn from God himself. Galileo, I do not feel obligated to believe that the same God who has endowed us sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. When I reflect on so many profoundly marvelous things that persons have grasped, sought, and done, I recognize even more clearly that human intelligence is a work of God and one of the most excellent. Kepler, Johannes Kepler. Our piety is the deeper, the greater is our awareness of creation and its grandeur, since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regards to the book. In regards to the book of nature, it benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather, above all else, the glory of God. And then René Descartes, the modern philosopher who revolutionized philosophy and mathematics. I see plainly that the certainty and truth of all knowledge depends uniquely on my awareness of the true God to such an extent that I was incapable of perfect knowledge about anything else until I became aware of him. Blaise Pascal. There are two kinds of people. One can call reasonable, those who serve God with all of their hearts because they know him, and those who seek him with all of their hearts because they do not know him. And then, of course, I could go on with various people like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton to think about what has, I would say, atheism or agnosticism or anything that is basically non-theistic in any sense. What has it contributed to the sciences or to philosophy prior to, let's say, the 19th century? I can't personally think of any individual who's contributed anything of any real value that was from a non-theistic position or non-polytheistic position. It seems that all of the greatest philosophical revolutions and scientific revolutions come through theistic or polytheistic thinkers. Aristotle and Socrates and Maimonides and Peter of Abelard and Sylvester II, William of Conches, all the greatest thinkers and translators of Latin information that revolutionized thinking in general have all been done by theists, polytheists. And I don't say that thinking arrogantly that there aren't any atheists, but I personally don't know of any. I've actually sought to try to find some. I haven't been able to find any. I'm pretty sure there may be some out there, but I have been unsuccessful on that. The conflict thesis that there is a wall between religious thought and scientific thought really starts in the late 1800s. And it's largely contributed to Dapper and who's the gentleman who I forget his name consistently. It's actually important to say this. No, not Russell. Forgive me for wasting time. Andrew Dixon White, the co-founder of Cornell University, wrote a book in 1896 called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. And then, of course, his right-hand man, John William Draper, who a lot of people know for the Darwinian evolution debate between Thomas Huxley and the Bishop Wilberforce. He's the present antagonist there. And he wrote, of course, History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And this became kind of a mainstream ideology at the time for those who were moving towards a more naturalistic explanation of the universe. Which, interestingly, is primarily theistic. Even at that time, there were very few atheists involved. Charles Darwin himself was a retired Christian Unitarian, and then, of course, he lost his faith. But his partner, who's not named very much, went the opposite direction, rejected evolution on the grounds that he thought that it was absurd to his experiential reality towards emotions and human spirits and those kinds of things. Though that is not neither here nor there. So now the complete concepts such as like Galileo is an example that people commonly use as an argument of religion versus science. But a real in-depth study will show that Galileo's situation was far more political than religious, and you can't really pick any person in history that has been persecuted by the church specifically for scientific ideas. They're always in relationship to theological issues, such as Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno wasn't really put on trial because he was talking about the Copernican model. He was put on trial for actually being an antagonist. He upset a lot of people. He was ran out of town constantly. And I know he's used as a martyr for science, but a lot of people don't know he was a spellcaster and a wizard and an astrologist and all sorts of various things, which was fine at the time. The church was the one that banned the usage of magic. They never believed in a flat Earth. It's myth that never really happened. That's attributed to a 16th or 15th century polytheistic philosopher who converted to Christianity and kind of created his own version of Christianity. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. I have terrible memory. But just some examples. Let's see here. J.H. Brooks is a doctor of philosophy and science and religion. In his book from Cambridge University Press, he says, in its traditional form, the conflict thesis has largely been discredited. Dr. S. Chapin from the University of Chicago, in his book, The Scientific Revolution, in the late Victorian period, it was common to write about the warfare between science and religion, and to presume that the two bodies of culture must always be in conflict. However, it has been very long since these attitudes have been upheld by historians of science. And then, of course, Tim O'Neill, who a lot of people know. This is kind of an atheist face that takes a lot of pride in understanding medieval science, says that the fact is that the idea of the church suppressing science and rational analysis of the physical world is a myth. Not one medieval scholar was ever burned, imprisoned, or oppressed by the medieval church for making a claim about the physical world. This is why the modern proponents of the myth always have to fall back on an exceptional and post-medieval example to prop up this idea, the Galileo case. And of course, I could teach in a 6-hour class on why Galileo was much more about scientific elitism and social pressures with competing ideologies, Protestant versus Catholicism. And then here is one of my favorite writers. Let me find it. There he is, Dr. James Hannam, who wrote the book called The Genesis of Science. It's a fantastic book. He said the most significant contribution of the natural philosopher, which is a scientist, of the Middle Ages was to make modern science even conceivable. They made science safe in a Christian context, showed how it could be useful, and constructed a worldview where it was made sense. Their central belief that nature was created by God and so worthy of their attention was one that Galileo wholeheartedly endorsed. Without that awareness, modern science would simply not have happened. And that's the consensus that I've come to, and I'm not religious in any sense. I believe that the history of science has really been into the relationship to the ideology that it was rescued from the Greeks, in the sense that the Greeks believed that the universe was eternal, that it was almost nonsense, it was chaos and couldn't be understood in any logical sense, and that there was no true reason to understand or to know the world because it didn't really follow into the ideologies of the time, such as hedonism, that really the pleasures of the mind were more of a frivolous thing than truly a pursuit. It's more like Socrates and Plato who uphold those kinds of ideologies where they really care about knowledge. But it is the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish mind frames that really lay down the foundation for the three principles of wanting to know and build a scientific case for the world. It's a desire to know that the things that God has created, and not, this is not, of course, an argument that God exists. This is simply an argument that those types of ideas have promoted science to be a desirable field. Of course, scientists weren't really a thing back then. That wasn't coined until the mid-1800s by the Royal Society of London. But prior to that, they're the natural philosopher, and this comes as a pursuit that was at the expense of the individual. There was no job, the scientists. There was no occupation, or you didn't make a salary or a wage. You had to sacrifice personal time and money in order to be a scientist or natural philosopher. And so that pursuit was really upheld by the church. Now, the church is the one that promoted science. And of course, that's not just the church. I mean, also the mosque, also the synagogue. that they actually cared to pursue the sciences because it was beneficial to knowing and understanding God. It was, as Kepler had said, that it is the ultimate attribute, the mode of worship of God is to know the things that God has created. So in that, I will go ahead and close and turn over my time to my opponent. Um, I I sadly did not hear anything that Brian said, and I don't know if anyone else did. I sure hope so. So I can't really make a rebuttal to anything he said, Shane, sadly. So I'll just run over some points that I think are important when considering the validity of this topic. Um, Science arose in Western Christendom and not really anywhere else. That's an interesting causal thing to wonder why science arose in a highly religious area versus another. But I think that those can be falsely attributed um, to the rise of science being to the rise of agnosticism or the rise of atheism. What's interesting is that the decline of science actually happened after the fall of Rome, and then resurrects in the fourth and fifth century because and through Christians and through Muslims and their interexchanging of literature. That's of course war trophies that they have conquered. All the various countries, and through that they loot their libraries and they keep their books. And luckily, knowledge was important to them. So they wouldn't destroy books unless they saw it as an absolute heresy that had no epistemological value whatsoever, such as the Alexandria Library and the Serapeum and those kinds of various things. Knowledge was just as good as gold, if not better. So the rise of science comes from translating the Greek manuscripts. Cosimo can be largely attributed to the transliteration of Greek and Latin that gave rise to the open information once the Roman Empire had fallen and split into two. Language had failed because they decided to keep with Latin in the West, and they stuck with Greek in the right and southern part of Italy, and that's why you see the advancement of East to West versus West to East when you look at technology and then architecture and painting. Why did the Christians and the Muslims revolutionize medicine and these kinds of things? Scientists, every great attribute to the sciences that we use today is kind of a myth that science has progressed from the beginning till now. The science has sputtered in lots of decades where nothing has simply happened. Even currently, within biological evolution, within modern physics and Big Bang cosmology, we're flatlining. There isn't a gigantic leap in scientific progress, and that's not to say that science doesn't work or that it's not working. It's to say that there are boundaries that every generation we meet that are not easily overcome. And I think that we are getting to the point where we are learning just about everything, and there's not much left to learn. So the Christians and the Muslims, they're really responsible for the establishment of the university, for the creative tension of trying to understand the things about God, the nature of God, and the nature of the world. The discovering of the world was really a palatable idea because of the idea that the universe was created and orderly, and that it was worth investigating because it was a avenue or a mode of knowing and doing your part to better to know God. A misconception is that science is technology, but it's false. Science arose because of the advancement of technology. Those things they're not synonymous. It's a conflation to think that science is technology. Science didn't really progress until technology progressed, which was just in and after the medieval ages, which is why ultimately you see all the modern science arise out of the Middle Ages because of the advancement of technology out of necessity. And I am running out of time, so I will close with that and say, Brian, I appreciate you being here. It's a shame I didn't get to hear what you said. Hopefully I can review it and maybe talk with you later about it. So no big issue. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, now I'm afraid. Can you hear me now? No, oh, great. So probably nobody could hear me before. That's fantastic. So it was just me being a talking head that nobody could hear for 12 minutes. Well, I'm going to quickly sum up what I said then so that everybody can hear it. I did switch headsets. Maybe my other headset was being stupid. Apparently it was. So great. Fantastic. Okay, so Aristotle is the father of biology, Greek, 400 years BC. Thomas Aquinas brought his thinking and his works into Christendom about 1700 years later. That's even after Islamic faith actually brought in the Aristotelian thought. Before that, everything was more Platonic thought. So you had people worrying about the spirit, the hereafter, what's out there in the ether, all these frou-frou things, rather than the fruit. Sorry, I apologize to anybody who is religious. It's not necessarily frou-frou. You do what you do. The Aristotelian view is dealing with the physical world, and Aristotle was a very secular person. He did not necessarily believe that his science was influenced by his religion. He believed in the secular view. So him being one of the founding fathers of science and really influencing the way people look at the world gets to the point of it being fundamental. Somebody who's non-religious, somebody who has a secular view of their science, being one of the foundational people in scientific history, makes it very clear that religion is not fundamental to scientific progress and reasoning. The idea of progress, forward or onward movement toward a destination, if we go from where we knew nothing until what we know now, there's nowhere we can point and say, well, because of this person being religious or because of this religion, we have scientific progress. There were people who were religious who did push forward scientific progress, but I did it. You just Google a quick list of atheist scientists, and it's really long. Lots of Nobel Prize winners. Lots of people, who did amazing things. Linux was created by an atheist. Lots of Nobel Prizes on the list. Theoretical physicists. And this is really a list that just runs from really 20th. It goes back a little further than that in some places, but it's actually a fairly well researched and actually footnoted list, unlike most things on Wikipedia. And then I also have a couple of articles that actually list some people. Neil deGrasse Tyson is agnostic because he doesn't want to call himself an atheist. Alan Turing is definitely an atheist. Stephen Hawking, I think that's questionable, but it is also an article on Alternet, so I don't really trust most of those things. But there are a few other people there that definitely are on the list and did amazing things. Nuclear physicists from the Soviet Union. And actually the woman who was really key, Rosalind Franklin, she was key in figuring out DNA. She was an atheist. The idea that religion is fundamental falls apart when all of these people are a part of it. Religion is not necessarily anti-science, and I would never claim that. I think that at times it can be. I think that at times there are people involved in religion who carry out anti-scientific things, like forcing creationist teaching in schools. Only creationist teaching in schools, not teaching evolution or any modern scientific theory on how we came to be what we are today. That's broken. That's anti-scientific. There are other times that there are things that are anti-scientific. So once you get to the point where religion can cause anti-science, you also take away the idea that it's fundamental to scientific progress. Just on a logical basis, it's something that at times even creates an environment that is anti-science cannot be fundamental to science. And reasoning. So reason is the power of the mind to think, understand, and form judgments by a process of logic. The idea that religion in and of itself, a set of teachings that is meant to give people a sense of why they are here, of where they came from, and how they got here in a book, or or just internal soul searching, whatever the religion may do. The idea that most of those things help with reason is a little counterintuitive. The logic isn't there. My reason says that it's not reason. It's not the reason that is involved in religion. It's faith. And those two things are not in competition necessarily. You can have faith and still reason out the scientific part, but the faith isn't helping you with the reasoning. There's not a point in science where you say, you know what, the Bible said it, so I'm pretty certain that that has to be how it is, and now my tests are showing it's true. I think I talked about in the Bible, it's a flat Earth, it's a geocentric solar system, I guess, Earth system. I can find all the things. I'll put them down below, all the different. Actually, I'll put a link to somebody who has already done all the different Bible verses that actually say these things. That firmament, the sky above us, is actually basically essentially a glass dome that is keeping the water that is beyond that glass dome from rushing down upon us. We are a water sandwich. There's water below us and there's water above us, and it's all held back by the earth and firmament. So those things aren't good science at this point, and we're pretty sure of that. So the idea that religion is fundamental to scientific progress and reasoning falls flat in those ways very, very quickly. And I would like to thank, I'm very sorry about my technical issues. It was an interesting night for that. And I'd really like to thank you for coming on, and vote. If he beat me, go ahead and vote for him. If I beat him, go ahead and vote for me. If you really enjoyed watching me just talk with no sound for 12 minutes, definitely vote for me too. I think that's definitely a winner. Otherwise, thanks to Call Out. I think we both like to thank Call Out for having this debate. Thanks for everybody who's working with them for making this happen. We really, really appreciate it. And don't forget to vote down below. Right now it's pretty even. Nobody vote for draw. What is that? That's like kissing your sister. You're not sure whether you think somebody won or not. That's not a thing. So just vote. Just go down and vote, and